Welcome to our weekly series of Impact of AI podcast. This week, we are going to focus on how leadership can lead the organization to embrace the impact of AI. And today we are fortunate to have Laura Goodrich. She is the co-founder of GWT Next, a global workforce transformation company. Laura Goodrich is an expert on transformation and the future of work. She has over 20 years of experience as an executive coach and is recognized by Thinkers 360 as the top 20 thought leaders in transformation, future work, risk management, change, culture, and technology. Wow, congratulations. Her global perspectives on workforce dynamics and change have earned her the reputation as someone who can create positive outcomes, even in the most challenging workplace dynamics. She was recently recognized as the top 10 most aspiring women to watch in 2020. Laura, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about our conversation, Melissa.
No, thank you. For introductions, my name is Melissa Drew. I have 27 years of experience in supply chain and procurement, specifically focusing on cognitive and AI technology since 2004. I was recently recognized internationally with the Global Leaders in Consulting Excellence and Influence Award. And I'm also recognized by Thinkers 360 as the #1 thought leader in procurement. Glad to have you.
I'm glad to be here with you.
You know, I was reading your website, and one of the things that really struck me as why this is going to be such an interesting conversation is as the organization is embracing AI, it's really impacting everyone. It's impacting the individuals who have to go and procure those softwares that AI is infused in. It's impacting the users who will be using those systems. It's impacting the individuals who are going to be maintaining them technically. And ultimately, it's impacting the leaders who really are going to have to take a more broader role in upskilling their resources. And so one of the things that was really neat about what you do with your global workforce transformation company is I read your website and there was a quote there that said, "Those who embrace the future are the ones who will shape the future." And I think what you and I talked about earlier is that the leadership is really the key to how the organization is going to embrace AI.
It is key. And here's one of those moments where I say, talk is cheap, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really easy to say we're forward leaning. It's critical that we all are. But the truth is that all eyes are on leaders. And so they're looking at what kind of effort are our leaders making? And are they putting the time in to understand these emerging technologies? Are they confident enough in themselves that they're okay with looking a little foolish or not having the answers? And that's very difficult for people that have a lot of tenure and want to have the answers, mm-hmm. to show that it's okay to be learning in process. It's okay to demonstrate that it takes a bit of effort to learn it because everyone is watching. So talk is cheap. And so that means we have to leaders need to back that talk with actual effort and the steps that they're taking to learn it, to understand it, and even to own that they don't fully understand it is a really important part of ultimately getting people to rally behind them and to play a role in understanding and utilizing these emerging technologies.
So one of the questions that came up, recently was, does the leadership have a more active role in getting the skill sets to their employees? And I think what I'm hearing from you and based on your experience is, it's not the employee. I mean, the employees can go and take classes, but if the company is going to embrace AI, what I'm hearing is that, yes, leadership absolutely needs to take that active role.
Here's an example that illustrates just that, Melissa. Okay. So I had a conversation with an individual contributor. And she said the organization was rolling out a new technology. And she said, it's interesting. as I observe the leadership in the organization, I see some that are very excited about it and really digging in and learning a lot. I see others that are just sort of carrying on business as usual. And I see others that are being very vocal about their distrust of it, their thoughts about that technology, all the negatives of that technology. And I said, tell me, how does that cause you to behave? Or how do you behave as a result of that observation? Or what do you do? And she said, nothing, really, nothing. I mean, until I see that they are literally linking arms and that they are taking this forward and leading the way, I'll just sort of sit here in the back seat.
Oh.
So think about that. I mean, that's really critical. And that's why when we have conversations with organizations, we ask the question, who are your most forward-leaning leaders? Do you know who they are? Are you tucking them in very close? And are you giving them the support that they need? Because if you think about sort of a boat making its way through water, that front edge of that boat is it is moving the water. So it's very critical to know your forward-leaning leaders. And then next, who are your more neutral leaders, not negative nor positive about this technology, more neutral? And do you know who they are? And then think very strategically of how you bring those two groups together. Now, the third group are our detractors, and they're folks that are just like, henny penny, the sky is going to fall, all kinds of terrible things are going to happen as a result of these technologies. And the truth is that all of these technologies do have a side that we're going to have to guard against, right? Everything does. Right. Everything does, right? If you're a parent, then you know that there's some really positive sides. And if you've ever had a teenager, you know that it's like being pecked to death by chickens. I mean, there's negative and positive in all things, technology included. But, definitely the bottom line with that is, do you know who your most adaptive, forward-leaning leaders are? If you don't, figure that out. Who are your more neutral leaders? If you don't know who they are, figure that out and be very strategic in thinking about where you begin. Because if you're not strategic and you just sort of go, well, I'll choose that person because I like them. And I'll choose that person because our children both play soccer. So we're selecting the wrong people to be a part of our opening moves. We're selecting the wrong people to really influence and create that forward momentum. And forward momentum is key, particularly in the beginning.
I don't think I've ever really connected the dots because I'm in organizations all the time, and I'm working to implement some of these technologies that have these AI, underlying AI concepts. And, we have standard change management approaches, but I don't think I really connected the dots until just now that the behavior or the ability to embrace change, across the internal organization is directly influenced by our leadership and directly influenced by the leadership's understanding of what that technology is and how they're embracing that change. And I don't think I really fully connected the dots until just now. I think you've articulated it really, really well for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, this is where we had a conversation recently with a leader, and they said, well, we tried something like this. It didn't work very well. And I'm sure that's something that you've heard, on numerous occasions. And again, they just randomly plucked people out of the organization without really thinking about who is going to lead the way, and how do we create that momentum? And then the next question that we need to ask is, what are the things that we can do that can foster this and that can influence behavior? And we've got a lot of things that we've learned over the course of time that can really help with influencing that behavior.
So then if we move through the storyline and the organization has now picked the right leaders that are going to influence this change, the right leaders that through their behavior and their conversation will allow the rest of the organization to really follow along. So once we have that in place, so then what's the next step?
Well, the question that I've always asked all along is, identifying people is important. It's critically important. But then is how do we design a process for those leaders to really create that awareness, understanding, and ultimately that commitment? Mm-hmm. And so we look at it. It's everything but, a big meeting with balloons and a pretty cake in the front of the room, right? That's a great place to start with presenting and sort of sharing the direction and the whys and the what it means and what it means if we do and what it means if we don't. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great place to start. It is no place to stop. And so we always think about how do we design a process that really supports those leaders in their journey of developing the mindset and the skills and to lead the way. And we've learned that that needs to take, that's not an afternoon and it's not a meeting, right? There is no easy button. So we always look at that process, including one-on-one coaching for those leaders so that we can sort out the unique challenges that they're facing. We bring a cohort group of leaders that will be charged with leading the way together because we've recognized there's power in them working together. And we create accountabilities. So we identify what are the action steps that these leaders need to take or that have proven to really advance and move things along, not only from their own perspective, but also the influence of others. Mm-hmm. And then we track that. And over the course of time, and then we use stories. And so one of the questions that people always ask us is, how do we keep this top of mind? When people are getting 250 emails and have back-to-back meetings. The second that we sort of have this conversation is, the moment that people walk away from it, all of those responsibilities take hold. So how do we keep things top of mind? And that's when we began the process of introducing stories in that process over the course of time, really short stories that people could consume, but it would keep it top of mind because stories are so memorable.
You mentioned a moment ago about changing the mindset. And this is something I'm really passionate about because being able to influence others is not just disrupting their behavior, right now, but it's how do you influence their behavior so that after you walk away, that behavior will continue to sustain. And that's always been, a huge challenge, especially when you're working with these new technologies in an organization that has never been, exposed to them before. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier was about the changing of the mindset. Can you go a little bit more into that?
Sure. We define mindset. I mean, we kind of boil it down to the assumptions that we have. But we really, when we're thinking about mindset, it's assumptions, it's methods, and beliefs. And they are very deeply ingrained and they're reinforced within organizations. It's not something often that's sort of printed on the wall or the things that are printed on the wall, but it is that ongoing assumptions, methods, and beliefs that guide us. And there's a lot of internal support to maintain the current mindset. So one of the biggest obstacles is the current mindset to creating that next mindset. That's why it's important that we identify what are some assumptions, methods, and beliefs. And then how do we define in a way of what it needs to be going forward in such a way that people can latch onto it. So once we define what those assumptions, methods, and beliefs need to be like, then the most powerful way to influence human behavior is stories. So right within every organization, there are stories of people that have shifted their mindset. Stories of people that maybe didn't see the opportunity or didn't understand how AI could really make a difference in all facets of the business. But by way of engaging in it, They have realized that. And so that is one of the most powerful things that we help organizations do is how do you tell that story? And then the beauty of storytelling is that we can get those stories to a lot of people. We have means by which to get those stories to a lot of people. Peer pressure doesn't stop at 16. It has always influenced, right? It has always influenced human behavior. So find those individuals that are exemplifying what you need to see. And it's even better if it's the story of individuals that people were not exactly jazz hands about it, right? They were not exactly excited. Maybe they had trepidation, maybe they had worry, and they share that. And then by way of really being disciplined in their approach to understand it and to learn it, they've come to see real value in it. And that influences. Because the trouble is with when we talk about an emerging technology and we share about AI, a lot of time we've got a bulleted list of words, right? Here's our bulleted list of words, and they just don't translate for people into how am I going to operate and work and lead, and how will this influence what we do and what we bring to the marketplace? Those things are much more difficult for people to envision if we don't help them envision them, if we don't tell those stories and help them get there.
Can you, so that we have this recorded, can you provide the example of, can you provide an example of how that mindset can block somebody's path to moving forward?
All right. So the question of how can mindset block the path to moving forward?
Yes.
We can look back historically in all times of transition, and we can see how mindset can get in our way. The statements that were made from very high places regarding the automobile, statements like America has always been a horse-loving, country and will always be. There is really no future in the automobile. Right? We can step even closer to where we are now, and very big names denied the possibilities of the iPhone. PC Magazine said, that Apple's reputation was seriously on the line with the introduction of the iPhone. So, this gives us an example of how those that have vested interests of how things have been, it's very common that they're going to advance their mindset and thought process. And that's why we have to be very careful in who we're listening to and the voices that are getting, magnified out there, because in the examples that we've found in our research, they are really big voices. These are extremely prominent voices. And it doesn't matter what that emerging technology or that change is, there will those detractors, and they can be very experienced. They can have a great deal of an experience, and it's not uncommon that they can be in a position of influence as well.
No, this absolutely, this resonates with me. I'm going back to all the examples in my head where I walk into an organization and the executive sponsor for a particular program is the one that everybody hears the most, the one who speaks the loudest. And oftentimes he doesn't speak at all, which creates that negative, which I think what you're saying is, he's either not the right fit, he or she, and he speaks the loudest, is not quite, embracing it, or he's being identified as that executive sponsor and he's not speaking at all, which that silence can also provide a negative perception.
It tells a story.
Yeah,
is what it does. It tells a story, and people are paying attention. They are watching this, especially now, because we're in this space where there's so much uncertainty about where we're going. And there's never been a time where we need leadership to be able to confidently step forward and speak about these and sponsor these movements, but also in the same breath, really identify that we'll need to iterate along the way, that we're not, that this will be a process that will change, over time, and we'll have to iterate. Because, and why do I say that? Because so often people will say, well, we started here and then they changed and then they changed again. Well, the truth is that there is no straight path forward with this, right? It will be a process where we need to iterate. And that's another thing when we work with leaders that are in that role of champion or, an ambassador of changing things, that they are, that they're owning the fact that we will, this is not a straight path. So here is where we're going at this point in the direction that we're going to take, but together we'll have to figure this out and make changes along the way to determine our best route.
So the leadership role is much more important. It's much more prevalent to being able to take that workforce and transform it to the next phase of that evolution. Let's dive deeper now into what exactly you're seeing in your experience about some of the things that leadership can be doing. Like, what are some of the takeaways and lessons learned that you've seen?
I think that's really an important piece. What are the steps that we see leaders taking that help them, make this journey? Because that's a big part of that process. So this gets into those accountabilities that I've talked about, is we pay very close attention to what are the steps that the most successful leaders are taking that help that first help themselves. It's sort of like being, getting oxygen first on the airplane, right? It has to start with them. The first is a very disciplined approach to researching these technologies. So we're not going to be resistant to AI if we've had a very disciplined approach to reading about the emerging technologies and researching those technologies on our own. We call that high beams on research. So, if you imagine yourself in your car and you put your high beams on and recognize you're able to see further and more. And that is one of the elements that we build into the process. Why? Because we've seen that leaders that do tend to see the opportunity that is realized in those technologies much before others. Another thing that is really key is actively seeking dialogue and conversation with people outside of their given industry. In particular, the most forward-leaning individuals. Who are these leaders? Who are you having conversations with? And we build that in, that that these leaders are having conversations with other leaders in industries outside of their own about the emerging technologies. What are they seeing? How are they using it? What are the lessons that they're learning? And this gives us a perspective, and it often will really move that leader and ultimately that individual contributor to a place where they're, rather than being in the back seat, like we talked about, where they really are in the front seat and playing a role, not only in their own personal influence, but the influence of others. And then the last element that is very powerful in the personal commitment learning process is sharing stories. And we know that stories are memorable, and they also give the individual leader and individual contributors, as a next phase, they give them the opportunity to begin to take those words that are bullet points on a PowerPoint presentation and bring it to life in terms of what exactly does this mean? How are these technologies being used to create good, to increase productivity, to understand clients better, however they might be leveraged or being used?
I was taking notes. I took notes. I was like, I'm taking notes. This is great.
Good.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you think is really relevant and important?
I I think that one thing that's really relevant and important, so I'm going to come back to, it's not uncommon when we begin to bring something, whatever that transformation is, or let's say it's a new technology that's going to have a cascading effect in the organization. And you mentioned that when we started off, Melissa. There are many facets of it. And I think there are even, it goes well beyond the facets even that you mentioned to, how are we going to sell? How are we going to market? How is IT going to support this? So there's many, many layers of it. But so we often begin that process with a big presentation. And as I mentioned, that's a great place to start, but no place to stop. I next said it's important to look at if we really want to empower our leaders, to look at it as a project and a process that has distinct steps and accountabilities that we build in. The next thing is that we have found to be very successful and important is that each of those leaders creates that learning opportunity on their team and those accountabilities on their team in that small unit. And so you start bringing those pieces together, leader, team, leader, team, leader, team, and you begin asking that question about transformation, right? How do we create transformation that really becomes systemic and in the bones of the business? And we have found that that is the most powerful way to do it, rather than going, let's figure out how we can move this massive ship. Let's figure out how we can empower first the right leaders and then give them the tools to create that same process on their team with each team member and the team as a whole.
What I've got so far is some of the key things that are really important is recognizing that leadership has a much more impactful influence over the behavior of the workforce. And understanding that certain leaders are going to be embracing change more than maybe other leaders. And those are the ones that you really want to focus the attention on. Those are the ones that you want your workforce to look up to and follow. Right? Okay. And then the third thing I heard was that working, one of the things that you've brought as part of your expertise in the global workforce transformation is being able to help redirect or change or reshape that mindset, getting them from, hey, today, this is how it's done. And we've done it like this all the time. And this is how we've done it for the last 20 years. Why do we need to change? And really helping them overcome that, get over the hump and recognize that change is a positive thing. It's good. It's good for the company. It's good for the employees. This is how we need to get from, move forward.
Right. And I think a really important piece, and these are the nuances to the process that we, more than anything, have been keen observers of human behavior, right? That's how we've gotten to where we're at now, is being keen observers. And to the point that you just identified, Melissa, is, when we say, here's where we're at, we don't want to just say, here's where we're at. We want to say, and you did well, and this accomplished a lot. We want to acknowledge what we have accomplished, because one of the things that will really get in the way of people considering what's next or what is new is that sense that what they have done is diminished or not appreciated, or, and so it's not only do we want to say, here's what got us, this got us here, and it was critical to our success. And you played a role in that. And that we don't want to brush past that without acknowledgement, because our experience has taught us that is something that people will really get caught up in. Wait a minute, I dedicated 20 years of my life to this, and now you see the next shiny object out there, and that diminishes what I've been. So we've got to stop and say, here's where we're at, and thank goodness for the role that you've played and the contribution that you've made. It was critical and important. And in the same breath, things have changed, and now we need you to be a part of what is next. If we do not acknowledge that past, and we do not elevate that past and really give it the tip of the hat that it deserves, that is another point that people will latch onto and hang tight and get angry and get, and that's where we start seeing behavior that really confuses people. It can be a major obstacle to moving forward. So in a sincere, honest way, acknowledge what has been.
I am always an advocate for change. I truly believe that change is one of the most important things that needs to happen. And I'm always deflated when I work with a company who says they need to cut the price and the first thing they want to cut out is the change management approach. I think what I'm hearing today, and I'm hoping the audience is really connecting with this, is that the change is not just a matter of helping people understand what's changing from point A to point B, but the approach to changing the workforce, the true transformation of that workforce mindset, is recognizing that what they've done up until this point is what was needed, but that as the landscape changes, through the consumer demands and the economic global landscape, now the organization needs to change. And then the leadership this is how we need you to change with us. And I need your help. And that message, everything that we just said, never happens. It's always, here's what's going to happen from now going forward. But I've never heard anybody really step back and say, here's acknowledging what you've just mentioned, acknowledging what we've done to date, but then here's why we need to make the change. And oh my gosh, that's so enlightening. Thank you.
And to not just do it once. And not just do it once. It has to be repeated over the course of time in different ways. Acknowledge what people have created. Create the urgency for what is next and the need for help, because real transformation is, it's widespread. And so if you don't look at it and really think about it in those terms, then it's likely going to be a meeting with balloons and cake. And in this case, it's going to be on Zoom and you're going to drop ship cookies to people, or I don't know, exactly what you're going to do.
I've seen some of those lately. Yeah. You mentioned earlier about the stories and the storytelling and how it's important to wrap that in. Given, your expertise, can you give us some examples of what do you mean by storytelling, but more specifically, what are some of the tactical ways that you're able to tell that story?
Well, we're filmmakers, so we do, stories in film.
Okay.
And we do, create a narrative. So essentially identify a place that is common, that we see commonly in a change process. And then we ask, what's the hitch in the get along? What's the holdback there? And then what story could we share that will help people get beyond those unconscious barriers? So one of the things that we've learned is that there's all kinds of barriers to change, and most of them the vast majority of them are unconscious. So people don't wake up and say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sabotage that AI technology that's moving into our organization. Nobody wakes up and says, that's what I'm going to do. And yet we see that in the behavior. So in those places and in that transformation process, we identify what is a story that we could use. So here's an example. One of the stories that we have produced is a story of a musician named Billy McLaughlin. And Billy McLaughlin was an international phenomena and a solo acoustic guitarist. So he's in the middle of the stage, and all of a sudden, two fingers on one of his hands began to curl. And he didn't know what it was. And he later learned it was a condition called focal dystonia. And it was a permanent and untreatable condition. And the doctors told him to find a new profession. And he said, Well, I have no control of my dominant side, but I do have control of my less dominant side. And he closed himself in a room and he taught himself how to play on his non-dominant side. And I did an interview of Billy that we share in this story. And I asked him, what was it like, Billy? And he said, well, I had to learn how to be comfortable being really bad, because I started off playing Mary Had a Little Lamb. And so that's an example of a story that we incorporate in our process. And it tends to bring out different things in different people. And that's the power of story. And one of the things that we've learned is let it be to you something different that it might be to me. Let it be. So the power of a story is that you can share it. And then if you ask, what does that mean to you? 10 people could have entirely different answers, right? An entirely different response. I might speak to them from a different angle. But that's really the beauty of that process, because I'm now getting into me, my sort of where the steps that I need to be able to take to make my way through this. And that's the power of a story. So that's how we think about story.
Love that.
Right. And then we also, when we move into the phases beyond leadership, we began gathering stories within the organization. Now we're looking for stories of people within the organization that have had obstacles, perhaps as it relates to the technology, or maybe like in the story of Billy McLaughlin, life obstacles. It doesn't, we know for sure it doesn't have to be work related. Right. We can, we can draw upon story in different facets, but it's memorable. They're memorable. And so like I had an executive contact me. He said, I met you, Laura, in 2012. And he kept, and then there was this story, and then there was this story, and there was this story. So if you think about that, story is memorable and it sticks with us and it speaks to us in different ways. And that's why we feel so strongly about including story and creating the touch points of story that help people along their own personal journey to be aware, understand, and ultimately commit.
And I have to say, as you're telling me the story, I'm even more engaged in what you're telling me. So, I mean, I've experienced it right now, just, shifting from a conversation to telling me a story. And I can tell you right now, I remember the entire Billy McLaughlin story right now.
Yes. It's a good example.
It is a good example.
Even a better example would be if we talked 6 months from now, right? And that's not only do you have that story, but then your own story as it relates to it. Like we have, as a result of that story, we've had people share their story of being resistant to learning a new skill and their fear of learning that skill and their process of closing their self in the proverbial room and putting in the time to learn it and what that meant to them. So that's sort of the next phase that comes from it, is you hear a story and then you can translate it into your own mindset.
Right.
And then ultimately action that you take.
Brilliant. As we wrap up, I'm going to ask you to come up with a couple takeaways that we can leave behind for the audience.
The biggest thing that I'll always say, we never tell people how to change. We give them the tools so that they can individually do it. So recognize that the change process is individual. Begin with the right leaders. Early momentum will play a vital role in being able to create a cascading effect. Think about transformation and change as a project, because the notion is like, okay, we're going to change and we're going to just weave this into everything that we do. But the truth is, what we do is we just focus on task. And so we've got to make sure that we have a process and accountability. And we are, we're not just sort of leaving it to chance. because chance is going to lose to that task list and those, those projects that and those meetings that we're taking every time. Mm-hmm. I believe, and I'm sure that you are on track with, I believe that we're in a place of explosively fast transformational change. And I am passionate about playing whatever role I might play in empowering people to be a part of it, because I think there is a tremendous amount of opportunity that's going to come out of this ultimately.
Right.
A tremendous amount of opportunity, but everyone is going to have to learn new skills. I think we're all going to have those Billy McLaughlin moments where something is just not working as it once did. And we are going to have to close ourselves in a room and learn something new. And it may not, it may, like in his case, take disciplined approach day after day after day to get it. Right. And, one of the things that we're seeing, because we're seeing people that are already in that position where they've had to learn something new, is that one thing that they say to us, I didn't know I needed change. I didn't know I needed this, but, now I do, right? I was on easy street. I knew what I was doing. I knew where I was mm-hmm. going, but I think we're at our best when we overcome an obstacle. We learn something new. And so I would say more opportunity than threat for those that are first to put their hands up.
Okay. When we started this conversation, we said that we were going to focus on the impact of the leader to be able to lead the organization to embrace, technology such as AI. Is there one thing that a leader could be doing right now to start this shift?
Again, it has to be really personal. Okay. So leaders need to be have a very disciplined approach to research and be continually gathering increased depth and understanding of the technologies. It is critical in almost all industries that we step outside of our industry and get into conversations with people that are, maybe a bit ahead of us or trying these new things. There's a lot to be learned from those outside of our specific sphere and area of work. And then recognize the power of story, whether you're telling it like this, whether mm-hmm. you're recording a conversation of a story, whether, one way or the other, that's one of the most powerful influences of human behavior. So begin thinking about how to leverage that.
This was awesome. We're running out of time. This was great. Thank you. I've learned so much. I've learned that there's a really big difference between just going in and applying some change management activities versus really transforming the workforce. I've taken notes on steps that we can do to start working with our leadership internally to focus on shifting that mindset and embracing, the influence that leadership role takes. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for your time. I love the conversation. I think it's particularly interesting when we can drill down into a specific technology mm-hmm. because we can look at all of them. And, of course, there's a cascading effect of those. But, hats off to you for your work that you're doing in that area. And I've loved the conversation. Thank you for having me.